Good afternoon and welcome to the first TEQSA Talks for 2025. My name is Sam McAuliffe. I'm the Assistant Director of Policy and Research at TEQSA, and I'll be your host for this session. Today I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mary Russell, TEQSA's CEO, and Ms. Jen Bahen, TEQSA's Executive Director, Regulatory Operations. Unfortunately, our Acting Chief Commissioner, Ms. Adrienne Nieuwenhuis, is an apology today. I would like to begin this session with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, TEQSA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Our TEQSA office is located on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. Our agenda for the session today is as follows. We'll have opening remarks and an update from the CEO. We'll have a panel discussion on governance concerns. We'll then have an update on TEQSA's inquiries management, and then we'll move into a Q&A session before the meeting comes to a close. Regarding the Q&A, please use the dedicated Q&A function in Zoom. Questions will come through to TEQSA and we can pose them to the panellists during the Q&A session. And you can start posting questions at any time during the session and they'll come through. I will now hand over to TEQSA CEO, Dr. Mary Russell.
Thank you, Sam, and good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining us for the webinar today. So I want to we'll start by sharing with you that we are at the moment welcoming our incoming Chief Commissioner, Professor Kerry-Lee Krause, who's travelling and unable to be with us today. Kerry-Lee will start with TEQSA on the 8th of April. We also welcome Professor Elizabeth Moore, who has started her role as a Commissioner with TEQSA last month. And I'd particularly like to welcome our new Executive Director of Regulatory Operations, Jen Bahen, who is here with us today and braving her first webinar. So we'll hear from Jen later, in particular about some work that we've been doing to improve the quality of service that we at TEQSA deliver to our providers. So I'll just run through what I want to update you on today. Firstly, I want to talk about the work that we're doing to develop some new forms of regulatory guidance. Talk a little bit about the continuing work that we're doing to assure safety and wellbeing of students and staff, including some materials that we have out for consultation, and provide some updates about our regulatory process to assure that providers are meeting their obligations in terms of obligations to their workforce. So let's start by talking about statements of regulatory expectations, and I'm expecting that this kind of term, statements of regulatory expectations or SREs, will be new to many of you. So as some of you may have heard from us in other forums or through our consultation activities, TEQSA is introducing a new regulatory guidance format known as the Statement of Regulatory Expectations. We've adopted this format to address some of the risks to compliance with the threshold standards that have really emerged as important and significant risks that affect many providers across the sector. So you may hear us talk about these in terms of sector risks or systemic risks. So statements of regulatory expectation, when we issue them, will apply to all providers and may include additional reporting requirements in some instances. They're designed to align with and reflect the threshold standards, but they're much more detailed and drilled down in setting out what expectations we have about activities that should be undertaken by providers as part of good practice in dealing with these risks in the here and now. Unlike guidance notes and sector updates, which provide general advice and information, statements of regulatory expectation will be integrated into TEQSA's regulatory processes and approach, including for re-registration assessments. So another way of saying that is that when we issue a statement of regulatory expectations, we're really saying very clearly to providers that these are important expectations, behaviours, changes, areas for focus that we have identified you need to attend to in your organisation. And you should expect that when you have contact with TEQSA around either a re-reg process or any compliance activity, that we will expect you're able to show us evidence about your work to review and reflect on the extent to which you're meeting these expectations and any improvement or corrective actions that you're taking. So both doing the activities that are needed to attend to these, but also collecting evidence about that will be important. Okay, so where TEQSA identifies a greater risk of non-compliance, some providers or groups of providers may need to meet additional reporting requirements. And this recognises that it may be important and necessary for us as the regulator to have more frequent information than we would otherwise get from providers by re-registration assessments or by targeted compliance activities. So there are two of these SREs that we are intending to introduce in the first half of this year. The first is an interim statement of regulatory expectations in relation to student grievance and complaints mechanisms. And there's also a statement of regulatory expectations that will be coming out in relation to workplace obligations, and I'll expand upon each of these shortly. So I also want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in relation to social cohesion and more specific responses that have arisen since many university campuses and our wider community have experienced protest activities and encampments arising from conflict and tensions in the Middle East. So since our last TEQSA Talks in September 2024, TEQSA has continued to monitor and respond to compliance risk arising from these issues and incidents. We've kept a watching brief on incidents and engaged directly with universities where we have seen concerns. We've also commenced initial compliance assessment with a number of universities. We, like many of you, have seen some disturbing instances of anti-Semitism, including acts of violence in Australia since our last TEQSA Talks. Understandably, Australia's Jewish community has a heightened level of concern, and this will affect many Jewish students and staff in our university and higher education environments. We've also seen instances in our community and our universities of Islamophobia and other forms of racism targeting Australians of Arab and other Middle Eastern backgrounds. TEQSA fully appreciates that there continues to be a level of concern amongst students and staff from these backgrounds, including whether campuses are safe and supportive places for them to be, to work and to study. The threshold standards are broadly based and apply equally to all providers who have obligations to all students and staff, irrespective of their race, cultural background, religion or political beliefs. Last month, we wrote again to all providers about this. And we think it's a really important time with hundreds of thousands of students starting in higher education, both new and returning students. There's a real need for all higher education institutions to ensure that expectations, including what is and is not acceptable conduct, are communicated to students, along with information on how students and staff can access supports. All providers have an obligation under the threshold standards to ensure that there's a safe environment for all. So for the past few months, we've reviewed what is good practice and considered feedback from students, providers and other stakeholders to develop two new pieces of regulatory guidance. These are a statement of regulatory expectations that I mentioned on student grievance and complaints mechanisms. And this was something that came up repeatedly in our discussions with students and student representative groups and in some of the often quite harrowing and difficult stories that we had heard about people's experiences on campus in the last 18 months. We've also developed some interim guidance on managing external actors. This was an issue that emerged for many universities that experience protest activities and encampments, and we have worked with providers and more widely to identify some of the good practices and changes and review points that need to be considered in relation to this. So we're currently consulting on these documents, and I want to quickly provide you with some additional context. So in 2024, the Australian Parliament noted student concerns about complaint and grievance processes at universities and asked TEQSA to consider how these concerns could be addressed. In developing this statement of regulatory expectations through roundtable meetings and other discussions, TEQSA's gathered insights from students, providers, the National Student Ombudsman and stakeholders such as the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism in Australia and the Special Envoy to Combat Islamophobia in Australia. As noted in our consultation paper, we're proposing an additional reporting requirement around these expectations for universities. This is really important to make sure that universities are actively and transparently making improvements to these processes, but also using the learning that can arise from complaints to inform areas of risk management and improvement. So we'll develop the reporting requirements with the National Student Ombudsman and the Department of Education. And this is in keeping with our legislative requirements to ensure proportionate regulatory response to compliance risks. So next, I'll talk a little bit about the interim guidance for managing external actors. The protests at universities in 2024 also drew attention to the issue of external actors, so people who were not staff or students, but were active on campuses to promote their own agendas. There were concerns that these people engaged in many instances in behaviours that put the safety and well-being of students and staff at risk. In response, universities began reviewing policies and procedures to address this issue. One of the complicating factors for many institutions related to bylaws and statutes that applied to their campus land. And that meant that there were very different provisions and options available to different institutions to manage who could access their land and manage their responses to these activities and threats. One complicating factor for many institutions related to those bylaws, recognising that the responses to this will vary across the sector, we've developed interim guidance to assist all providers in considering and assessing the risks posed by external actors and planning the responses to these. So I would recommend both these documents to you, particularly during the consultation phase. Consultation on these two documents, the SRE and the guidance on external actors, closes at 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday the 27th of March. So we expect and are receiving quite extensive feedback on these, and we will consider, of course, all of the feedback before we finalise and publish the final SRE and the interim guidance, which we expect to have out sometime during April. Once this tranche of work is completed, TEQSA will focus on developing a statement of regulatory expectations around academic adjustments. And this is another area that emerged as an issue for students who had experienced adverse impacts on their wellbeing and safety during the past 18 months. We'll continue to engage with the sector on these matters and in any future work we undertake of this nature. We'll also continue to support the work of the sector and others to address causes and responses to risks to students' wellbeing and safety. So there is more. The other statement of regulatory expectations that I referenced relates to providers' compliance with workplace obligations. This is a really important area of systemic risk, applying to many providers across the sector. Obviously, a number of universities have released public information relating to issues of underpayment of wages and have needed to undertake corrective actions in relation to that. But we don't presume that this is an issue that is necessarily limited just to universities. Governance and in particular issues related to wage underpayments and compliance with workplace obligations is a key concern for TEQSA that is shared by government, parliament and the wider community. Last year, the Minister for Education requested that TEQSA develop new guidance and reporting requirements to address these risks. This followed a meeting in April 2024 of the State and Territory Education Ministers, where concerns about this matter was also raised. Despite repeated efforts to get providers to take accountability on this issue since 2020, TEQSA remains concerned that some providers have not taken full responsibility to pay their staff correctly and remediate their systems, processes and governance to assure this. So in coming weeks, TEQSA will release a statement of regulatory expectations about compliance with workplace obligations. This will set clear expectations for the actions all higher education providers should take to ensure they meet their obligations regarding employment laws as they're expressed under the threshold standards. So there's that reference to expecting providers will meet all relevant legislative requirements, including in relation to employment laws. There'll also be additional reporting requirements for universities. So in order to develop this new guidance, TEQSA consulted with the Fair Work Ombudsman, the National Tertiary Education Union, the NTEU, the Department of Education, Universities Australia and the Australian Higher Education Employers Association. TEQSA's registration and re-registration process are also being updated to reflect these expectations, and will communicate evidence requirements to applicants accordingly. So this refers back to what I was saying before, where there is a statement of regulatory expectations issued, we expect that providers will not only take action to ensure that they are complying, but also collect evidence that can be shared with us about those actions taken and how you're assuring that you're meeting those expectations and obligations. So, as I mentioned earlier, these issues typically stem from failures in provider governance, systems and processes. Given there's been much attention on governance within higher education, I'm going to take this opportunity to hand back to Sam to lead some discussion and conversation about some of the broader issues of governance that we think are live within the sector.
Thank you, Mary. As I'm sure many of our viewers are aware, the corporate governance of higher education providers has not only been a key focus of TEQSA's, but has also received increased scrutiny in the media and has been the focus of a recent Senate inquiry. So for the next section of our discussion, I'll invite the panellists to speak to this topic and outline TEQSA's concerns about governance in the sector and what our regulatory focus is. Mary, would you like to open before I prompt you with some questions? Or I can lead straight in with questions if you prefer.
Look, I'll open. And I guess here I'd acknowledge that many of you may have been following the current Senate inquiry into governance, quality of governance at Australian universities, but will also have heard us talk about governance issues as a key part of our regulatory focus, a key area of expectation for providers' accountability, both in our registration processes, but also in our compliance processes. So we've started to increasingly look at this not just in terms of issues and concerns with individual providers, but trends that are emerging across the higher education sector. And we have certainly been forming increasing concerns about governance issues across a range of providers. So these are concerns that don't affect just one or two, but are concerns for the sector as a whole, often irrespective of provider size, maturity or category of registration. So we really do want to highlight that this is a focus area for us in registration and compliance, and one that we urge you to really put on the agenda and make sure it's properly represented on the risk register of your organisation.
Thanks, Mary. As I'm sure many of our viewers are aware that in response to the Senate inquiry, TEQSA did make a submission to that inquiry, and we included some comments about TEQSA's concerns about governance in the sector. Would you be happy to speak about some of the concerns that were raised and why we found it important to list those?
Sure. So what I'll do is maybe just speak briefly to the types of issues that we raised in our submission to the inquiry. That submission is public, so I'm sharing with you and happy to kind of elaborate on some of what we found. In doing so, I'm not wanting to imply that these are areas of substantial failing for all providers, but they are so significant and important, and concerns are arising so frequently that I would certainly say that they are areas that need active and considered attention from all providers. So the types of things that we've been seeing and that we shared with the inquiry include issues and problems with financial oversight and risk management. So these types of concerns can span from poor financial planning and financial reporting, and particularly in a very dynamic sector, concerns that arise around poor financial risk management, not just in relation to managing the types of static and ongoing risks that many providers would make provision for, but also in terms of having really well-developed plans and strategies for responding to changes in the sector as a whole, and changes that might impact on the financial standing of providers. We have certainly seen a range of really concerning issues arise in relation to governing body effectiveness. So here I'm talking about councils, senates, or other peak governing bodies that are responsible for share responsibility for the corporate governance of higher education providers. Types of areas where we've seen really significant problems and issues include very problematic recruitment processes for university councils, poor decision-making processes in some instances. That can be lack of good frameworks around decision-making. It can be poor responses to tensions and difficulties that have arisen in the way that individual councils or governing bodies are making decisions, and poor resolution of those, particularly when roles and accountabilities of elected and appointed members can be in tension and conflict. Poor management practices in relation to conflict of interest. This is a recurring theme and a real area of concern for us. Challenges in exercising sound judgment on complex issues, and insufficient oversight and management of key risks. So these are obviously really fundamental and, as I say, really, really important issues for all providers to consider where you may have exposure, where you may have problems and risks that you need to address. We've also seen a pattern of some regulatory compliance issues, particularly around weak self-assurance processes. That's a real concern for us, given the discussions we've been having with the sector and the guidance and advice we've been sharing increasingly over the last couple of years about how fundamental this is in our regulatory model. Other sorts of compliance issues, inadequate reporting of increased risks of non-compliance with the threshold standards. And certainly we are regularly alarmed by types of things that occur with providers where we fail to receive material change notifications. So I would ask you all to really think seriously about whether you're applying the right thresholds and lens to that. Other areas include workforce and employment problems. I've talked about issues in relation to underpayment, but there are some real concerns that many providers have not yet fully addressed about casualisation of staff, executive remuneration concerns, and workplace law non-compliance. We certainly see some alarming examples of weak oversight leading to the realisation of some important risks in research and academic misconduct, some immature arrangements around course monitoring, and this has been absolute bread and butter for providers, particularly those who have self-accrediting authority, that should be just fundamentally and deeply, deeply embedded as part of good practice, not only in terms of what happens, but the active role of academic and corporate governing bodies, as well as executive management in monitoring of these. This is really not an area where we should be seeing any weaknesses now. And I guess the other issue that is part of public debate and is going to be one that needs to be increasingly considered by senior management and councils is the really strong debate about limited public reporting, about limited engagement with students and staff in governance, and insufficient independent oversight. I raise all of these knowing that that's a challenging and comprehensive list to share with you, but really by way of saying, as you know, we regulate according to risk. There are fundamental risks to governance that are expressed in these ways. And this is an area where if you are not already really actively engaging with these types of matters, it is an area that needs focus and attention sooner rather than later.
I might pose a question to Jen now. As our Executive Director of Regulatory Operations, Jen, you oversee and manage our regulatory operations teams. And in response to that list that Mary has provided, or in response to aspects of that list that Mary has provided, and noting the diversity of providers that comprise Australia's higher education sector, would you be able to provide a degree of insight into some of the ways that providers can demonstrate self-assurance about some of these governance issues?
Yeah. Thank you, Sam. And firstly, thank you for the very warm welcome from Mary. It's wonderful to be joining my first TEQSA Talks webinar, having joined TEQSA earlier this year in January, and I am delighted to be here. Governance is undoubtedly one of our bellwether standards that we consider across all regulatory processes in the regulatory operations team. The sorts of issues that Mary has spoken about affirm the criticality of governance to you and your organisations. And to that end, we continue to sharpen our expectations around how providers address questions related to governance, and the way in which you develop and mature your own systems. I want to emphasise that that's across all regulatory processes. It can be most apparent for a provider through a re-registration process, but it's equally important to think about how you will show us that and tell us that story across all other processes, whether that's a targeted compliance activity, initial registration application or others. I would like to shout out a couple of specific reminders about the ways in which you can tell us how you're addressing these challenges that Mary outlined. These processes allow you as a provider to think about how well you're addressing all elements of governance, including but not limited to the list that Mary provided earlier. Firstly, the threshold standards require that providers undertake an independent review of your corporate and academic governance every 7 years. That's really important in and of itself, but that review should not gather dust on the shelf. Your consideration of the review is as important as the review itself. And when it comes to our regulatory processes, such as a re-registration process, we expect to see some evidence that you're taking action against the findings of that review. Secondly, the narrative that you write within your self-assurance statement in preparation for your re-registration, which we know many of you have now engaged with and many of you will engage with soon, is equally, if not more critical. And it can and should be more contemporaneous than the review I referred to above. The self-assurance statement allows providers to explain to TEQSA, or to use some other language to assure TEQSA, the way in which your governing bodies and frameworks are allowing you to meet the threshold standards, address risk, and make system improvements. Thirdly, and Mary has addressed this for me, I will call out the importance of material change notifications and explaining those processes and thoughts within material change notifications. And if you're unsure as to whether you need to make a material change notification, you can contact us. There's good information about lots of these things within our website, particularly within the re-registration application guide, and I encourage you to read our website as you prepare for engagements with us, or if you have questions about these sorts of things that we've discussed. I will also flag, finally, that we'll continue to sharpen our own advice to the sector on these matters over the course of this year and indeed into next year. Back to you, Sam.
Thank you, Jen. We'll now transition to the next stage of the TEQSA Talks. So we'll be sticking with Jen, our Executive Director, Regulatory Operations, and she'll be providing an important update on a key piece of work that TEQSA has been undertaking, which is our centralised inquiries management.
Thanks, Sam. Once again, it's my absolute pleasure to be here and to introduce our new inquiries management system to all of you. I will flag, for those who have been with us for a while in the broader TEQSA environment, you'll be aware that our current system involves a set of case managers. These staff are spread across the regulatory operations group and they hold case management responsibilities and other regulatory operations responsibilities, whether that's working in the re-registration team, our initial registration team or others. Feedback from our service charter review, annual survey of providers, did highlight some need for change in relation to the way that we communicate with the sector and the way that we manage your inquiries. We absolutely acknowledge that feedback, and that's why we're here talking to you about this today. We know that consistency is one of the main issues, and we're very aware that relying on individual case managers where staff can be ill or absent or indeed move roles both within and outside our organisation can lead to a lack of consistency in responding to your inquiries. So the case for change was strong. To that end, TEQSA is establishing a new inquiries management team. In fact, we have already established a new inquiries management team within my group, the Regulatory Operations Group. I want to assure you that the team has extensive regulatory experience and knowledge. While they may be newly formed, they are themselves not new. And we will make sure the service charter is being updated, and we will share that with you in due course. But I want to give a little bit more light and colour to how the inquiries management system will operate. And I'll find my clicker. First of all, we'll start soon on the 1st of April 2025, which means that all provider inquiries will be managed centrally by our Central Inquiries Management team. I mentioned before that they're a dedicated group of senior managers, again, who are not new to TEQSA, but rather a newly formed team. I want to make a couple of other call-outs about the way they'll think about their work. It's really important to know that our inquiries management team will be committed to monitoring the progress of inquiries. We will endeavour to answer most inquiries in a timely manner, but we know that some will be complex and we'll need to reach out across our organisation to find out the right answer. Our inquiries management team will keep you updated with where that inquiry might be and when you can expect a response. We also know that knowing the history of you and your provider and your organisation is important, and many of you have engaged with TEQSA for many, many years. The inquiries management team will be reaching out across our organisation to make sure they understand your history and to make sure they can develop the most fulsome answer to the inquiry. So they don't sit in isolation, they sit within the team, they will lead inquiries management, but all staff will still have responsibility for making sure our responses are accurate and timely and consistent. So why are we doing that? This transition will ensure that you as providers receive timely and consistent responses. You'll be less impacted by changes in TEQSA staff. And importantly, we'll be able to keep data around common inquiries. This means that we can do work across TEQSA for potential self-service products on our website or other pieces of advice that we might be able to give the sector as a whole. For those who like things presented in a diagram, this is really just the previous slide presented diagrammatically. Our inquiries management team will manage our general inquiries. They'll also manage your provider inquiries. I do want to call out on this slide that if a provider's in a regulatory process, whether that's a re-registration process, initial accreditation process, you will of course work with the assessment manager who's responsible for that specific process. When that is complete, we'll return to the inquiries management team. How to get in contact from the 1st of April. You do not need to remember that date. We need to remember that date. But we will remind you with a series of communications. You'll receive an email and there'll be social media and other forms of communication, including to peak bodies. Internally, of course, there'll be a transition period where we'll make sure we work across the entire RegOps group to support your history and to engage within the things that you might have raised with us before. And all previous inquiries management inboxes will, of course, still be monitored and inquiries dealt with in the most appropriate way. And naturally, there'll be a review point. We need to see the volume of inquiries and the types of inquiries before we decide an appropriate review point, but naturally that would be at least 6 and then 12 months after commencement. And probably my most important part of the whole presentation is that as we implement this new system, we want to hear from you. If it's working for you, please let us know. If it's not working for you, please let us know. There's lots of different ways that you can do that, and we encourage you to get in touch with us. That's it, but I'm really happy to take questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Jen. I am monitoring the Q&A live as we go, and I can see that there will be some questions coming your way, Jen. This is the part where we are moving into our Q&A session. And as I just mentioned, I am monitoring the questions as they come through. So I will be beavering away at a laptop here, identifying questions and posing them to Mary and Jen for responses. A really quick reminder that there is still plenty of time to pose a question, so you can pop it in the Q&A function and it will come through to us. We'll try and get through as many as we can. I'll start. We've had a few questions coming through in response to topics that we've raised throughout the session. So I'll do a few of them that are quite thematic in succession, and we'll address those as we go through, and then we'll open up to some of the other questions that have come through that aren't necessarily directly tied to what was asked earlier. So one of the first questions, actually we have 3 in a row that are going to relate to statements of regulatory expectations, which I think are asking some really good questions that will clarify some things for the sector. So the first one, great question about how statements of regulatory expectations apply across the sector. So the question is, will the statement of regulatory expectations be tailored to individual providers, considering the varying context and operational differences between small independent higher education providers and universities? Mary, would you like to speak to that one?
Sure, that's actually a really good question. And it's one of the things that we'd really invite you to share with us when you consider the documents that are out for consultation. So essentially what we've tried to do in the SREs is actually sort of say, look, good practice should address these types of considerations, while recognising that the way that that might happen will differ for different providers. Now, size and scale will matter. So if we think about something like the one about student grievance and complaints processes, that might apply really equally to large and small providers in terms of the policies that you have in place. It might apply differently in terms of the types of units, whether they're in-house, whether they're outsourced. The ways that you respond to the complaints and grievances might differ, but the principles that are in that SRE are principles of good complaint handling that are recognised and scalable more widely than just in higher education. So we've tried to capture those expectations in a way that we think is pretty universal and applicable to different higher education providers. If you identify particular problems or issues that you think we need to take into account before we finalise that, then please let us know. Where they will differ in some instances is the reporting obligations. So there are some types of issues that have been where we have been tasked to ensure that there is reporting from university providers that may not in all instances apply to independent higher education providers that are not universities. So there will be some differences particularly there. But please, as you look at the documents, think about the, not only the intent but the implementation, and share your feedback with us.
Thank you, Mary. You touched on the next question in your response there, but I think I'll pose it again anyway, just to make it explicit, because this question did come up several times in the Q&A function. So when you state that Australian universities will be required to report annually RE compliance with the workplace obligations, does this include other providers such as university colleges or higher education institutes?
Okay. So when we release this one, this will be clear. There are particular requirements in terms of the nature and the form of that reporting, including attestations that will be required from Australian universities. What I would say, though, is that the information that needs to be reported by universities to TEQSA is structured in a way that I would expect that the governing bodies of all higher education providers would want that same information reported internally, and that the monitoring and oversight should cover the same dimensions. So in keeping with our practice, as far as possible, we've tried to make reporting requirements that we have as the regulator reflect what a good and active governing body should be seeking as assurance for itself. So I think in that way they are applicable to all higher education providers, but TEQSA's specific requirements for reporting, there will be some differences for universities.
Thank you, Mary. And one more regarding the SRE. Will the SRE be required by TEQSA-regulated ELICOS-only providers?
So SREs will apply to all registered higher education providers. This is a really unique and important sort of subgroup of providers. I would particularly invite that provider group when you read the consultation draft for the SREs to reach out to us if you think that there are particular problems or issues. But like I say, these types of measures to ensure providers are dealing with risks adequately and effectively and have good governance in place are generally, we expect that they should be applicable to and relevant to all providers. But please tell us if you're spotting particular problems with them.
Thank you, Mary. Our next question relates to the types of providers where these risks might be most prevalent. And would you be able to share if these concerns were noticed more in a particular provider category than others, or were they across the board, or any sort of targeted areas that we should be thinking about?
There is no room for complacency around these things. We are seeing these problems across public and private providers. So they may appear differently with individual providers, but they're not unique to a particular part of the sector. But they are important to all. So we share this in the context of our approach to risk by saying where we are alert to risks and problems, we will share that information with you because the responsibility for actively managing those risks sits with you. And I would say whether you're from a private or a public provider, this is something that can be dealt with both at a big picture level, but also at a very practical level. So, at a practical level, having shared this sort of information with you, we would expect that should be the subject of a paper and some really detailed discussion in executive groups, in governing bodies of any provider. There should be discussion about, are we asking the right sort of questions to understand these types of risks and whether they're present for us? Are we getting the right sort of information to assure ourselves that we don't have problems in these areas? Have we encountered difficulties that we haven't properly resolved about the way that our governing body is working? When we next commission an external review or when we do an internal evaluation, which of these things should we focus on and ask questions about? How are we going to frame the terms of reference for a review that we might commission to cover the risks here that might be relevant to us? So this is everybody's business in the higher education sector.
Thank you, Mary. Mary, I'll give you a brief respite. Jen, we have a few questions regarding the inquiries management. So the first one just relates to the existing model of case managers. And the question is the case manager role being phased out? Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. The simple answer is yes, the case manager role is being phased out and replaced with the inquiries management team. The case manager or case managers will be known to the inquiries management team so that we can transfer history and context. So those people will not disappear, of course, but the concept of an individual case manager role is being phased out and replaced with the inquiries management team.
Thank you very much. And it's like these questions were just designed to fit together really nicely. So building upon that, from a provider's perspective, how will this impact the current case manager approach?
Yeah, I do think I've largely answered that in the previous question, in that we are phasing out the case manager approach and replacing it with that centralised inquiries management team to create greater consistency. One thing I'll probably call out and maybe should have earlier is we know for some providers and case managers this does work well. Feedback around inquiries management within TEQSA is never consistent. There's always mixed feedback, but there was enough weight of feedback to convince us that the centralised inquiries management team and approach would increase consistency for all providers, and that's certainly the aspiration. As I said, the case managers are not disappearing from TEQSA. They will focus on their regulatory operations roles.
And last one, at least for now, on the inquiries management, Jen. Currently, the TEQSA case manager model involves a TEQSA case manager contacting a provider's principal contact. Will the principal contact component still exist in that TEQSA prefers one person at the provider end?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And what I should also reference is that there'll be a bunch of FAQs that are put on our website come the 1st of April, and there is an FAQ that addresses this. There will still be the principal contact, so when the inquiries management team receives an inquiry from a provider, they will check that it comes from the principal contact, and if it doesn't, they'll refer that person back to the principal contact within the provider. So there is a preference that we have one person at the provider end that is the principal contact identified, because we know that the weight of inquiry could be very high if we didn't manage things in that way. But there will be an FAQ that addresses this.
Thank you very much. So the next question that I'll ask relates to, sorry, I've lost it on my screen. Bear with me. Here it is, sorry. Okay, so this relates to what was presented at the last conference, I believe. And TEQSA showed the sector a new regulatory risk framework and invited feedback. So has that come into effect? Is there any update there? Has the framework changed? Mary, you might be best placed to respond to this. Can we get an update on the new regulatory risk framework?
Sure, and we're still really excited about this. This is a really, really important piece of work for us to land. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we had representation in our post-conference workshop by almost every provider from across the sector. And thank you so much for committing the time and really deep thought and engagement to helping us to develop and settle this piece of work. We received masses of feedback from that workshop, and we are still in the process of working through that and making changes to the framework to reflect a lot of what we learned from our discussions with you and what is necessary to make sure that that framework is useful not only for us from a regulator perspective, but also can integrate and be picked up and used well in your operations and particularly in your risk management and assurance activities. So we've got more than we anticipated, and we're making really good use of that feedback. The other thing that we're doing is simultaneously looking at what we're going to need to change about our processes to make sure that we are ready to apply this in the way that we go about our regulatory work. So, we want you to have confidence that when you come to us for a re-reg process or a compliance process or a course accreditation process, where you are referencing the concepts in the risk framework, the ways of managing and responding to risks, that we have aligned our processes to expect and respond and use that type of information. So there's a lot of work that we're doing in-house around how to make sure that we're picking that up and reflecting it, and that those two things will be able to land at the same time. So we will be coming back out with an updated draft of that for consultation across the whole sector later this year. I can't tell you exactly what month that will be, but it's certainly the next big stage for us, and we really welcome sort of feedback and thought from all across the sector in relation to that. I will acknowledge that that is also the lead piece of the regulatory strategy that we've been talking about, and we will continue to develop across the course of this year. We will that will be a different type of document that sort of builds on the concept of this is how we understand and respond to risk, but goes further in talking about how we go about our regulatory work, the regulatory principles that we apply, the way that we prioritise certain risks, the way that we keep the sector updated about the sorts of risks that are emerging or are of concern to many providers across the sector. So there's lots of work that we will anticipate rolling out, but the next thing that you'll see for consultation will be an updated version of that risk framework.
Thank you, Mary. The next question moves away from some of the themes that came up today, and as we're sort of back into TEQSA's regular operations regarding our compliance priority report. Is there an update that we can provide on our 2024 report?
So, as most of you will know, the compliance report is based on calendar year data. So we can't even begin to analyse a full year's data until the end of 2024, which we have done. The team is still in the process of not only of kind of looking at the data, but really considering what use we need, well, what it tells us about the sort of guidance we should give, the sort of expectations that we might need to address. So we're trying to look at that to make sure that we're giving clear and focused guidance and expectations out of that, as well as sharing that data with you. I will say that our approach to identifying priorities will, or compliance priorities, will likely change somewhat from this year. As we've talked about today, the types of risks that the sector have been facing over the last year or so have changed really rapidly, and some of them are things that we would not even have envisaged a year ahead. So the guidance I will give you there is to say that, as we've discussed today, we have a really strong, clear and driven focus at the moment on governance, both corporate governance and academic governance. We have a very clear focus that most of you will be up to speed with on academic integrity, and increasingly seeing the rapid developments in the technology around artificial intelligence. Really needing to see very close attention and effective attention to assessment integrity and the way that all providers are ensuring that students who receive an award have demonstrated that they've achieved the relevant learning outcomes and graduate capabilities. And I think the other one that we've talked about today is the focus on expecting that providers will be able to show us that you're responding to the risks that have been identified out of the student protests and encampments. Particularly those that are covered in the statements of regulatory expectations and the guidance that we've issued. And I would stress again that, while much of this is informed by the experience of providers who had significant protests and encampments on campus, that does not mean that all providers shouldn't consider what might the impacts of these types of activities be on your staff, your students, and assessing and making sure that you're prepared to manage any future activities or protests or similar sorts of issues, particularly around racism and discrimination that might arise in the future. Bearing in mind that is, of course, a key area of focus in the threshold standards as well. So that's the guidance I would give you at the moment about the sorts of things that we'll have a focus on in the coming year.
Thank you, Mary. You touched on, in your response to that previous question, you touched a little bit on generative artificial intelligence, and we do have a question here for either of you to pick up on. Does TEQSA have any current or planned initiatives around managing and detecting Gen AI use, or broadly ensuring the quality of the student learning experience?
So our plans around this don't include taking carriage of or commissioning technological solutions. We know that there are organisations and agencies that have far better specialised capability and are doing work in this area, and will continue to produce solutions and adapt solutions. What I would say is that our focus remains on ensuring that that you've thought really, really carefully about assessment integrity and in a way that is appropriate to the courses that you deliver and the types of learning that you need students to achieve, that you have not only the policies and practices in place, but that you've really looked at, where in your assessment processes have you structured particularly robust assessments that give you a high degree of confidence in the student learning outcomes. This shouldn't be different from good learning and teaching experience. This should actually just be the modern expression of what needs to be captured in an environment where not only contract cheating services, but the types of technological solutions that are floating around out there mean that we need to change. We need to change and update the learning and teaching experience, and we need to reflect that continually and quite rapidly in changing the assessment practices that we have in place.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to acknowledge now that we are getting towards the end of our session, and there are a number of outstanding questions in our Q&A inbox. So I'd really like to thank you all for posing the questions and apologise that we're not able to get through all of them. We will finish on one that I'll direct over to Jen. This has come up several times in various formats, and I think there are still a few lingering concerns about the inquiries management. You have touched on this briefly, but it might be worthwhile just having an explicit statement about it, noting that it's come up a few times. And the question is, one of the strengths of the case manager model was in-depth understanding of providers by an individual at TEQSA. So how will this in-depth knowledge be maintained in the new system?
Yeah, it's a good and relevant question. We certainly don't want that in-depth. So we're talking about past in-depth understanding and then how we'll manage that moving forward. So there's two elements to that. In terms of making sure we capture the past in-depth understanding of an individual TEQSA officer, our individual TEQSA case manager, as I mentioned, those individuals are not disappearing from TEQSA. They will have other roles within TEQSA. In the transition period to the new inquiries management team, it will be the responsibility of the inquiries management team to not just send back a quick answer to a question, unless, of course, there isn't an obvious quick answer. It will be the responsibility of that team to go and talk to the case manager about the history, to review the file notes and the file of that particular provider, because of course all our case managers are still required to keep detailed files and file notes about the interactions that they have with providers. So it will be an important feature of the transition to make sure that that past in-depth knowledge is not lost. It will have already been captured, but there will be conversations that take place to make sure the nuance and context is captured. Moving forward, the inquiries management team, which is a small team, will build that knowledge themselves and again make sure they build that knowledge across our platform and our systems, and making sure that's captured in case there's staff movement within the inquiries management team. So probably two summary points I'd make. One is that this has been a topic of conversation as we roll out the inquiries management function within TEQSA. We are very alert to the concern. We have processes and strategies in place to make sure that we manage it. But secondly, that is something that we want our inquiries management team to hold moving forward and into the future, and they will reach out across TEQSA to make sure that that's done. If it isn't working, as I said earlier, for you as a provider, please do reach out to us and make sure that we can do some work behind the scenes to capture that history, context and nuance. But it's a really important feature of the system.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, I'm going to wrap up the Q&A there, and we'll move into some very quick, brief closing remarks. So first and foremost, thank you all for your engagement and your really thoughtful questions. And thank you very much to Mary and Jen for being here today. This is the end of our first TEQSA Talks for 2025. However, it is not the only TEQSA Talks for 2025. Please remember to register for the next one, which is scheduled for 24th of July. Also, please mark the 2025 TEQSA conference into your diaries, the dates of which are the 18th and 19th of November. Our events team are doing some fantastic work preparing for the conference, as well as coordinating events such as this. So I'll finish with thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.